Hey everyone, welcome to we have a fun name for this one, so I want to make sure I read it correctly. And welcome to the How to Bulletproof Your Story When Fact is a Four-Letter Word. My name is Emily Wilkins. I'm on the Board of Governors here at the National Press Club, and yay! And I have the honor of introducing Yvonne Rolzhausen.
Yes, good.
Rolzhausen. I practiced before,
points.
but I'm still nervous. Okay. Yvonne is the research chief at The Atlantic and the head of their hugely respected fact-checking department. She started there as an intern and is still there 26 years later, which is so impressive. We're really thrilled to have her today. Yvonne, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I hope you have sustenance to deal with the very heady topic that we're about to talk about. But I appreciate you coming. So as Emily said, I'm at The Atlantic, and I feel very grateful and lucky to be there because everything at The Atlantic is about having thought-provoking and truly momentous pieces. But we always have recognized that in order to have the power in terms of our journalism, that they have to be right. So the commitment to checking and to accuracy is so strong there. But sadly, as we sort of all know in this world of ours, the facts desperately need champions. And so your being here today is a sign that you're committed to that as well. So we're in good company. The issue in terms of that we frequently deal with is that the truth should be simple. It should be based on empirical evidence and based on facts. But the issue that we find again and again is that oftentimes it's not simplistic. It's complex. It needs time. It needs care. It needs devotion. And it needs a subtlety of thought that in our very crazy clickbait world, we often just don't give to matters of import. So I'm hoping that by the end of today that you'll sort of come away with a few tips, a few things that I've seen in my years of checking wonderful and great and not so wonderful and less well-known writers about where we make mistakes about when we look at information online, where we make mistakes when we talk to people, just basically where the pitfalls are for many journalists. So feel free to sort of ask questions as we go through. It's a small group, so hopefully everyone will get their questions in. And I like to have questions because it helps me to know what you most want to take away from this. I want to quickly, I do have a whole host of handouts that I'll pass around at the end and that you can look at. One of them is basically about how we do magazine checking. And magazine checking is sort of at a very detailed level. For checking, you have everything from, a quick check of names and dates for something that's going online to a full-on magazine check. A magazine check is something where we go through everything that the writer went through. We go through all of their sources, we talk to all the people they talked to, we read the books, we go through all the studies. Yeah, I know, it's yikes. It's wonderful. What do you mean, yikes? So we basically replicate what the author has done. We ask them for a footpath for us to follow. We take apart every piece of their article to put it back together again, hopefully stronger and even better, and to make sure that everything can be basically defended if need be. So it's a careful exercise. And why it's great when a checker can do that exercise rather than the writer is because we're supposed to be the guardian angels. We're supposed to be the unbiased source on their shoulder saying, look, I read this piece, I talked to this source, and I got a different interpretation. You missed these few lines that are at the back of the page, and they say the exact opposite of what you're saying in the beginning. So it's a give and take. And people often sort of say, oh, well, gosh, isn't it controversial and how sort of argumentative is it? And do authors appreciate it? And the bottom line is that if you go towards a piece and an author with respect, they will treat you with respect as well. And I have many of my best friends are the authors that I've checked over the years. It shouldn't be confrontational. This is a conversation. They've been in this world for a lot longer than I have, sometimes years, months, what have you. So I need to be respectful and I need to go to them with all of my concerns, but also, and to have good evidence for my concerns, but to have a really wonderful collegial relationship with them. And that's the only way that I think that checking can actually benefit a piece. We don't want to destroy a piece. We don't want to add in 1,000 excuses. We want to shore it up, and we want to make it better and more readable than when we got it in the first place. But what we are doing is exactly what, as journalists, you should all be doing. You should all be double checking your pieces. You should all be keeping track of the sources that you use, going back to the sources when you're finished, double checking things, realizing that you might have changed a particular quote and now it's in a different context. And so to make sure that the person who said that to you will agree with that context still, and that you haven't destroyed the meaning of something. You should all be going back and double checking things to make sure that you didn't all of a sudden take something out of a book and fail to attribute it. The plagiarism word, it's a terrible word. And you recognize that the moment that someone can poke a hole into one of your stories, the moment they can undermine practically anything that you say in a particular piece, means that that piece suddenly becomes worthless. No one is going to believe you if they recognize that you've made mistakes. So the impetus is it has to be paramount that you want to get it to be as accurate as possible. So all of the things that a checker does is exactly what a reporter should be doing again and again. The most responsible journalists that I know always go back to their sources. Even if that means, gosh, I have you quoted as saying such and such, and we talked about this, and remember, we were in the cab, and it was at the last minute, but it was, the fulcrum of what we were discussing. Can I use it? Can I attribute it to you? The difficulty with this is that basically reporters are all too often afraid that because they've gone back to a source about a particular quote or detail, that person is going to say, oh gosh, I never said that. There's no way that you can use that. And there's a big difference between someone who recognizes that they're on the record, audio is right in front, tape's going, everyone sort of recognizes that this is an on-the-record conversation, and then going back to them and then them trying to pull out. I can't tell you how many times sources have said to me, I didn't say that, I didn't say that, I didn't say that, and I'm looking at a transcript where they said exactly that. And I'll say, well, you did say it because here's the context, here's what I have. We are going to run with it unless you can tell me that there's some reason why you spoke out of turn, you didn't know what you were talking about, you don't know the information is correct, on, and sort of to understand the circumstances. I think there's always this concern that by going to a source and by discussing what you're going to publish, that it's somehow going to blow up. A checker and any good editor wants it to blow up prior to publication. I wanted to blow up in my hands, because I can then figure out, have we made a mistake? Is this true? Is this correct? Is this so legally problematic that we should be getting a lawyer involved in it so that they understand the complexities and that we can basically inoculate and build up the article? Everything is about care. Everything is about making sure that it is correct. It doesn't mean that if someone tells me that they didn't say something that I'm not going to go and say, we have it in the transcript, I know they're saying now they deny saying it. Let's put that in the article because it shows that there's a question here, that they're worrying about how it's going to be perceived. That's part of the story too. So we will still run it. We will just run it understanding what the parameters are that have possibly changed since the interview was done. But every good journalist that I know does that. They go back for comment in order to determine whether things are right. So ballpark, that's sort of just the most general sort of understanding of magazine checking. It can take a few hours, it can take a few days, it can take a few weeks, a few months. It depends on the story, it depends on whether it's a legally problematic issue. Everything sort of depends on sort of the situation you are in terms of timing. That's a very different story from web pieces, but again, it's just a different understanding sort of it. So, any questions? No. Everyone always questions about the quotes, but obviously you're warming up. So basically, what I want to do is talk about what people often get wrong. Because I think that sometimes when you know what people get wrong, when you read the corrections and when you see where mistakes happen in a piece that you're sort of looking at, you start to understand sort of where things need greater shoring up. And when the sort of first level of where people go awry is that they use bad sources. So rather than going straight to the source of a piece of information, they're going to use news clippings. Well, news clippings are usually wrong. So you just have to be so careful in terms of going straight to the closest source possible for that information. I sort of think about it as the bullseye theory. I want to go as close to where that piece of information originated. So if you're talking about a child being murdered, ideally you go to the parents and you talk about this with the parents. If you can't get to the parents, you go to a lawyer who's handling a case. You go to the police detective who handled it. You go as close as possible, and then you sort of pivot out as need be. And it's important to sort of also think through in terms of like with the bullseye. So say you're dealing about a child who's been murdered in Ohio. And if you can't get directly to the source, the New York Times is as tremendous a paper as it is, and as I'll always go to it for reference, oftentimes a local reporter who knows all the people, who may know the family, who may know sort of the police detective who spoke at length, who's been following a story for months and months, they oftentimes are the better person to go to about that story or about a news report than an AP Wire story that's just pulling up from aggregating from wherever. So again, always try to go as close to the source as possible and understand where that source is coming from. The next thing sort of on my list of foibles is failing to get comment. And I feel like I should have shirts made up and distribute them around, because there's a reticence for people to go and get comment from people. Sometimes I think reporters feel that that someone won't speak to them, so that they won't be able to get comment on a specific issue. Sometimes I think it's, again, that they feel that a piece is going to fall apart if they get comment, and if someone threatens them or says, oh gosh, it's not true. Or the sort of dirty little secret is that sometimes people won't get comment because they disagree with what the comment is going to be. And it doesn't necessarily parse with the tone or the theme of their piece. The greatest way to get yourself into legal trouble is to fail to seek comment. And I don't mean, and I will go into false equivalence, because that's not what we're talking about when I say failure to get comment. So failure to get comment is so tea manufacturer that we are now saying, you know, studies have been shown that within this tea there are carcinogenic elements that basically they've never acknowledged. Failing to go to the tea company and to say, this study from such and such has shown that there are carcinogenic elements in it. What is your comment? Can you show us studies that this isn't true? Can you give us sort of something? And then repeating that and giving it fair game. That doesn't mean that the comment, that you can't contextualize that you have to put it just in, you know, sort of for all intents and purposes. You can go back and then say, okay, well, the tea company said X, Y, and Z, but these 17 studies have all pointed to the same findings, that there are carcinogenics in it. When we went to the president, they refused to comment on our follow-up. You can give, and you should be giving your reader and the audience a larger perspective. That's what journalists are supposed to do. We are supposed to give perspective so that someone can read something or hear it and understand what is the complex nature. So it's a key element that it's a funny thing to get piece after piece after piece from even really strong journalists who haven't gone to get appropriate comment. And it's what every lawyer who were here reading a piece, every lawyer who vets a piece is going to say the same thing. If you say something, give an accusation against a company, a person, show someone in a negative light, then you should always get comment. This is where we sort of get into the whole libel issue as well. Libel, obviously, sort of as you all know, in terms of the idea of, you know, clearly anything that is untrue is libel. Untrue and could cause an issue with someone's reputation. This is the, you know, basically most basic level of libel.
What happens if we said it in a press release?
Who said it in a press release?
Like the person that you're talking about in this story.
Yeah.
It's public information that they've released.
Mm-hmm. And as long as we're sure that it's coming from them. I know this sounds, it sounds like I doubt everything that I do, but yeah.
The onus isn't on the publication that published their press release. It's on you.
It's on you.
Them.
Yeah, basically. And something like that, if they're saying, you know, we definitely did not, you know, sort of use carcinogens in our tea, sure. And if we knew that that was absolutely, that press release was coming from them, no doubt. And again, if you can't get a hold of them, you could definitely use that. A person in their press release said that they don't, blah, blah, blah. It's not as informative as if you can have a conversation with that person, but you should definitely use that. And again, whenever anyone makes a comment, even from a public or a private individual, you should always look to see, even if they won't speak to you, no doubt they've probably commented it to someone else, and you can say, they told the New York Times, they told the Boston Globe this, and that's exactly what you do. It's not, it's not going to give you as much information as you would like, but it's much, much better than just leading it alone, which is key. So in terms of just about the libel, so for a private individual, you basically, it's something that's untrue that could harm their reputation. And the bar is obviously sort of appropriately set so that someone is protected who's a private individual. But the key to that is also that the journalist did not sort of give them an opportunity, that they did not show care. And this word comes up in my world, in my mind constantly when I think about why we need to do this. You need to show care. So that is going for comment. That is reproducing something that was said, sort of online, or that they commented on it before. If you have done that, and if you have done your due diligence, then for the most part, knock wood, you will be free from worries about libelous suits. For a public person, the bar is set much higher, whereby it has to be, for them to win a case against you, that they have to show absolute malice on your part. So you knowingly published something that was wrong about them, and yet, sort of did not, and it's still causing issues. So clearly, it's a very different parameter. But the difference with a public figure or a company is that they have huge pockets, typically. So even though they basically, they'd have to go through a lot of hoops in order to present it, they have lawyers on hand. So you want to be careful, and you want to sort of constantly ask yourself the question of, if someone has denied a piece of information, if they have, sort of continued to argue their case should be shown as well. And before I get to false equivalence, let's talk very quickly about something that every journalist should read and use as their Bible, the Rolling Stone case. You remember okay. Yeah, Columbia Journalism Review is the thing to get. So basically, where the Rolling Stone had a one-source story about a woman who said that she was abused by a member of her fraternity, and the only people that were quoted in the piece, with the exception of sort of a few ancillary characters, basically the story came from this woman. And obviously the piece was completely debunked within a few hours, practically, of it going live. The issue, if that checker, whoever, God help them, it was, if that reporter, if that editor, if any one person had called some of the main characters, apart from the woman who was making the accusations, 3 friends that were mentioned in the piece, her family, the fraternity itself, and given enough details so that they could comment fairly, the man who was not named but was accused, any of his frat brothers, if those reporters, if those editors, if those checkers had gone to any of those spokes outside of this one person, that story would have started to fall apart pretty quickly. The problem is that they did not go beyond it because they feared and they were sort of threatened with the loss of the story by the main person who made those accusations. So just sort of constantly think about the need to be careful about who your sources are and what you're relying on various information. Again, that bullseye. So if a person has been accused, you should be going to that person and saying, on such and such a night, you've been accused of this. You don't need to give any ancillary details, but you should be very, very cautious about a one-source story. Any questions? No? We're all okay. False equivalence. So when I say the need to have comment, I'm not talking about the need to basically present 2 sides of a story and say that both are equal. In this world, it used to be that, we had no concern about what false equivalence was because our journalistic standards were that we wanted to show balance. We wanted to show different interpretations, and that the onus was almost on the reader to look to it and say, oh, well, I know which is right by just having been given these 2 various options. Unfortunately, we're living in a world now where that is played upon our naivete and possibly our ignorance is played on constantly by people saying, well, you know, sort of in terms of, I think the biggest one is climate change, to give credence to the, you know, maybe one study out there that has debunked, you know, sort of, or says there's no climate change. To put that handful of studies done by lobbyist groups and by fake researchers, and to put that on the same level as the hundreds and thousands possibly of reports that say there is climate change and here are the reasons for it, and to basically put both of them together, it negates both arguments. It basically puts two things that should be at entirely different levels up on the same level. And it's something that we, as journalists, like the whole hope and how I started in this was this idea that you show both sides of a story, you show something that's balanced. But the problem is now is that we all have to judge what the evidence is. And not all evidence in air quotes, is equal. There's a huge difference between different camps. And again, that goes back to the sources of those evidence. So if that study has now been debunked by every single scientist, and if, you know, sort of the world at large espouses, and scientists at large who will never agree on anything, agree on this basic tenet, then that should always hold complete weight over this, you know, trivial little thing that is only being used in order to change people's minds. So now we sort of have this constant effort of needing to understand what is behind those suppositions. And at the very heart of it, what are those studies? Who is saying that? Where is this coming from? So that, again, is not the same thing as getting comment. And I think sometimes we make a mistake in our mind of seeing someone who has suffered a terrible crime and then doesn't want the comment from the, you know, sort of the tea company that poisoned them because of the tea, carcinogens in the tea. So I think that we always have to question just how much guidance to give readers and how much to be able to say. And again, scientific basis being sort of at the key of all of this. We have a wonderful journalist, Jim Fallows, who's, you know, famous for his being fair-minded, and for he is, you know, sort of at the heart and soul of the Atlantic. And he's always sort of talking about how that, especially for political reporting, the need to being supposedly fair to one side by including someone's perspective or the study or what have you, you have to ask yourself the question of if you're being unfair to the truth. And I think it's a good way to think about it, because you really do now at this level of basically lots of people lying, that you have to constantly say, okay, but what is the heart of it? Even if I disagree with it, I still need to understand what is the heart of it. So it's the only way to do that is what we as journalists should all be doing, which is to be looking at the evidence. Every conversation that I have in trying to convince a reporter why something should change goes because I amass evidence. I say, this source said this study said this, these TK experts disagree with how we're presenting it because it's exaggerated. I can convince anyone of anything if I have solid evidence. If I don't have evidence, then I'm never going to be able to convince anyone, never mind myself. So it's this amassing of evidence that we sometimes fail to do today because we're writing it in, 15 minutes or needing to produce it so quickly. But if I cannot convince someone of something that I believe they have wrong, it's because I don't understand it myself, and I do not have enough facts to back up my supposition. We can argue opinions all day long, and if you're writing an opinion piece, great. But typically, there are always facts underlying it. So it's the heart of it is to raise up the facts so that you know that the basis is strong enough. Another thing that sort of tends to happen is that we all oversimplify things. It's so difficult to explain, sort of a scientific process, what's going on in a court case. And God forbid anyone has to ask me about statistics at any point because I'm never going to get them right. So, but it's very complex and it's very dense, and as writers, you're trying to make things less dense for people. But what you want to do is you want to always be careful to know that your oversimplification isn't causing a problem, especially with court cases. I can't tell you, probably in every single time a reporter hands me a few lines about a court case and a piece, that I haven't sort of walked in and said, okay, well, you have to put in that the person is appealed, or you have to put in that this is, that they were, you know, sort of not accused, they were accused of this, but not this, and that this is, you know, what they're being sued for, on and on and on. It's all, everything depends on the details in terms of a legal case. So anytime that you're dealing with a legal situation, anytime that someone, you know, sort of is an alleged rapist, they're not a rapist, they're not a bank robber, they're not a murderer, they're not an arsonist. They're an alleged bank robber, racist, arsonist, whatever else in there. You have to sort of constantly sort of question yourself, has this person been formally found guilty of this, or have they admitted it? Two things, you know, maybe they admitted it to police, and so then you can be careful about how you word something. But if there's an ongoing court case, you have to be extremely careful about it. You can say, you know, sort of in it that they denied saying it or they denied doing it. You can say 26 people saw this, you know, person come into the Tree of Life synagogue and kill X number of people. But you have to be careful to say, the trial is ongoing, he admitted it to police, but now he's saying he, you know, is pleading not guilty. You have to give a fuller picture of it. Because the problem is that there are lawyers out there who literally just trawl all day long news reports to see if someone has basically made an accusation against their clients that they can then go after and sue. So you just need to be extremely careful to make sure that you know that person who you're saying did something wrong definitely did something wrong. So it's a loophole that even the best journalists fall into again and again and again. So I have this fear of walk-on characters, or what I call walk-on characters. So you could spend weeks working on a piece all about Timothy McVeigh. And in order to discuss, and you know, 10,000 words on Timothy McVeigh and, you know, sort of the tragedy that ensued with his actions. But then you have a tiny graph that talks about another bomber that's sort of a throwaway line, and you spent all of 2 seconds worrying, you know, throwing this in, and you think, oh, well, it just gives context to what McVeigh has done, and that's why it's important, blah, blah, blah. But you don't take near enough time to think about whether or not that person was actually accused, whether their name is right, whether there's been a court case, whether they're in prison, on and on and on and on and on. So take time with those throwaway characters who you're adding in for color, to make sure that you're giving enough time and effort into making sure that you know everything that you're saying about them is correct. Again and again, we've had issues that have come up because we haven't taken enough time. We're so focused on the fire over here that we fail to see the, you know, tree that's about to fall down and light the gas tank. This is a terrible thing for any reporter to have to do, and I hate bringing it up with people, but it's very crucial to update legal cases because, again, basically people can come after you for failing to say so-and-so is appealing this decision, or he still maintains that he's not guilty, blah, blah, blah. And it's something that you can get into trouble for, just in the same way as if you don't say they're an alleged rapist. Go ahead.
Do you mean update the legal cases? Sorry, can you wait too?
Do you mean update the legal case during your reporting process, or as in updating it on the website after it's run? Or
it's wise to do both is the answer, because basically what again, if it's an appeal, if it's an ongoing process whereby they're appealing or the case is just about to be heard, to say that and then to go back and to update it if at all possible. Because the thing is that lawyers, again, can come back after and say, well, even though my client was found guilty, he's appealing and you should have said that and we're going to come after you. So it is very crucial. And it's a funny little thing that every time I'll bring it up with sort of certain writers, they're like, oh, but I don't want to add in these silly little details. It's terrible, and yes, it doesn't really go with the flow to have multiple details about a court case, but it is really important from a legal perspective and for your own possible suit. Any other? Or did you? No. Okay. So I want to sort of talk about something that I call, well, sort of it's a spot the problem. There are a few of them in there for you, but I'll read out one, and you can see what you think and tell me what the problem is here. Okay, so Tom Goldstein, founder of SCOTUS blog, may be adroit at guessing which cases the Supreme Court will hear, but he's not especially good at winning them. Of the 25 cases he's argued, he's lost 13. In 8 instances, he failed to persuade a single justice to side with his clients. Okay, so now spot the problem. It's like a test. I should have brought candy. No? Sure, you can, yeah. Anyone? Go ahead.
Justice thing might be a problem because justices can't really decide alone, right?
Oh, that's a good point.
I
yeah.
don't know though.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. You get a half a candy, if I had though. Anyone else? No? Okay.
With convincing, thank you. Convincing a single justice, I guess convincing requires a change of opinion. So you'd have to know what the initial opinion was of the justice.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'll unless anyone else guesses, I'll give you the biggest problem. So, Supreme Court cases are unlike regular court cases. So for us, well, I'm not a lawyer. For us, when I look at this, I sort of say to myself, okay, right, well, yeah, he did lose half of them, and that's seemingly a pretty bad thing. But the reality is that most Supreme Court cases are not won. There's such a different parameter for judging them than there is for regular court cases. So we're dealing with apples and oranges. So unless my sitting here and sort of saying, oh gosh, well, yeah, that seems like a pretty bad record. But when you ask a lawyer, the lawyer's hair will go on fire because they're like, no, Supreme Court cases are entirely different. The fact that he even won 13 shows that he's fantastic. It's entirely counterintuitive from what we guess. And the reason why I bring this up as an example is because if we don't understand, if we don't have a legal background, if we don't understand fully that what we are talking about is an appropriate judgment, then we're wrong. And it's practically libel. So because we're saying this, sort of lovely man, who he is a lovely man, is unable to do his work properly. So if you had done two things, this would have been solved. If you had gone to Goldstein himself and said, by the way, so tell us about you won 13 cases, but you've argued 25. He would say, yes, isn't that fantastic? I've done so well. He would give you the context that you might need. Even if you couldn't get Goldstein, if you went to a legal expert or even started thinking about what Supreme Court cases are like, that would lead you down the path where you'd start to recognize, first of all, any lawyer would say to you, oh God, you can't say that that's a negative thing, that's a positive thing. So the key again here is to think about that you have to have a full understanding. If you don't have a full enough understanding of the topic or of the complexities of that, you should be asking someone who does. And this is the law of checking. You never assume, because I don't know anything about anything except possibly checking at this stage and maybe myself. The only thing that I know is that I need to always go to an expert. Go to the person, go to someone who knows. Two biggest rules of any journalism. So another one, I'll do one more and then I'll move on. So talking about general election during the Obama campaign, a pastor, Anthony Evans of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Texas, said he'd mobilize 300,000 volunteers and dispatch 72 church vans to battleground states on Election Day. He would touch more than 2 million voters. All he needed was $5 million to pay for it. The Obama campaign thanked him and said no. The pastor threatened to go public with a refusal. The Obama campaign pointed to examples of other black leaders who had confronted Obama in public and invited the pastor, in essence, to bring it on. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, who wants to go? You want to go.
Well, I would definitely say the Obama campaign is very broad. There's no person who represents it, and you need that site to check that. And also, as far as bringing in a comment from the Obama campaign to say that's not true or we did this.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, you definitely get a candy. See, next time I'll bring candy. And yeah. There is more, but yeah.
I mean, the dude would obviously be a fraud because churches are nonprofit, or they're not supposed to get into political campaigns because then they lose their nonprofit status. So the fact that he's claiming as a pastor to be able to mobilize all these churches for political operations is clear that he's a fraud.
Yes. Huh? And he needs 5 million, definitely. Okay. Well, what? Oh, go ahead, Emily.
I wondered if there also might be a bit of a problem with the phrasing of this plan. Would mobilize 30,000 volunteers and whatnot. I mean, it seems like I'm wondering, and maybe you'll disagree with this, if that doesn't sort of put it into context enough that this is something he's promising, but maybe or may not can deliver on.
Right. Okay. No, these are all good points. There was a pastor who approached very, very, very high up in the Obama campaign and promised them that they would mobilize, sort of all of these volunteers and dispatch all of these vans for $5 million. The problem, very, very big problem in this, is that it was not Anthony Evans of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship of Dallas, Texas. Anthony Evans is a man of God, and I'm telling you this because he did not sue the pants off of us for making this mistake. So let me tell you the backstory of this. This is, and Mark says that I should always use this because he still regrets this terribly. Mark Ambender wrote a piece, and the source of this information was someone that was very high up in the campaign. And had been a source for many things, a very trusted source who we spoke to at length, who swore up and down from now until Sunday that all of this was true and that Anthony Evans was the man we're talking about, on and on and on. We went back to him numerous times. Because of the fear that maybe it would explode, Mark and the editor decided not to go to Reverend Evans. Unfortunately, it was not Reverend Evans. And we found out, of course, immediately with the nicest letter I've ever seen from someone who's just been libeled beyond an inch of his life, saying, gosh, this is definitely not me. I have no idea who it could be, blah, blah, blah. And so we immediately went back to the Obama source, and they said, God, that's problematic, isn't it? Maybe it wasn't Evans. I am now on the floor having a heart attack. So yeah, it wasn't Evans. Got it wrong. Got it wrong. We didn't check it because we were afraid. That's the key. I want you all, if you take anything out of this session today, to walk out the door and to always remember this story. Because the reality is that we all get it wrong. We all get it wrong all the time. So you have to check things. If we had called up poor Reverend Evans and said this, he would have given us 1,000 excuses. But we would have started to say, and we would have immediately done what every good reporter does, is we would have gone back to the Obama campaign and says, Reverend Evans says this isn't crazy. He was in surgery, sort of for the 6 months that this happened. I mean, we would have had a conversation about it. So please, please remember this and always think about how important it is to get comment, to go back and to double check things with everyone involved.
Hi, I just had a quick question, but isn't it really easy when you do go back and check for someone just to say, that wasn't me? So how do you prove?
Yes, that's good. They all say that it wasn't me. But what you do is you say, okay, well, can you back up your story? Can you give us any evidence whereby it wasn't you? And he could have said, well, talk to, these 17 people. And even if he didn't give any evidence, even if it's just his word saying, this is definitely not me. And by the way, any other person, probably except for a pastor, would have said, and I will sue you from here to kingdom come if you publish this. So all of a sudden the stakes get a little higher, and then you have to sort of say, okay, we need more solid evidence than an anonymous source who will not show up for us in court because of where they're placed to back this up. So we don't have any evidence except an anonymous source. Every lawyer out there says an anonymous source is a non-existent source because they're not going to show up in the courtroom when we get hauled in for libel. So but ultimately it pushes you. If you ask the question, it pushes you to the next question. Or you say, if we then went back to the Obama campaign and they said, look, we're telling you, it's him. He might deny it, but it is him, and we have, reams of proof for you. Then we would print it and we would say Anthony Evans denies ever having, sort of said this, but it still would cause, ructions. So, but in any case, so yeah, that's my tale of woe. So let's sort of talk quickly about just things in terms of for online sources. And when you're looking at the web, like everything when I started was very different than for a few of you, I can imagine, in terms of that, I'd go to the BPL and I'd look through reams and reams of microfiche, I'd talk to experts, I'd do all of that. Remember those days? Yeah, they were glorious. Now, it was a much slower process, and it certainly, we didn't have the access that we do now, but the problem is that we now have to rely on a sea of lies and everything else in between. So some of my tips sort of for figuring out whether information is correct or not, the main tip is don't. Don't trust anything that's on the web unless you know what the source is. If you know what the source is, if you know that it's the Pew research that was done in TKTK, if you know that it's the CDC, if you know that it's the person who wrote the book on this subject, great, wonderful. You know what the source is, you know that it's okay. If you realize that it in fact is by a Holocaust denier site, you have a different story going on. You have to constantly sort of question what the source of the information is. There's this wonderful man, Professor Weinberg at Stanford, who did this big study about how he was trying to assess how young people being sort of through college, assess information that they find online. And he found that 80%, and this was a huge study of thousands of responses from kids and young adults, he found that 80% of them had trouble really discerning whether something was an ad or actually an appropriate source. Middle schoolers, God help them, couldn't tell the difference with half of it. High schoolers couldn't tell the difference between basically what has been identified as a hate speech site from something that came from a proper organization. It's very difficult to tell. Most people read vertically. You start at the bottom and you start to read. And as you read, your own biases become confirmed by the process. A good checker, always reads laterally. So I go to a site and I immediately say, okay, what is this organization? And then I immediately get off that site. I don't go to the about. Don't go there at all. That's nonsense. That's what they've written about themselves. I'd write fantastic things about myself if I could. You need to go to another site, multiple other sites, and say, so what is this organization? Southern Poverty Law Center comes up and they say it's a hate speech organization. Well, I'm not going to go there for my information. But we need to train ourselves to be skeptical enough of the information that we have in front of us because it's too easy to access almost. You have to sort of constantly question and go back and forth. Triangulate your data. Go to multiple sources. If I read 3 different news reports about a particular event and they all say the same thing, okay. If they're papers of record, sure, great. We have ourselves at least a scenario. If they disagree, then you have to go further on the things they disagree. But again, if you go to multiple things. And sort of the other thing that we're so used to the sort of fantastic tools in our hands in order to get information. But the most valuable tool sort of for any journalist is the phone to pick it up and to call someone. Use the internet to find the expert who's going to describe Supreme Court cases and what they mean, who's going to describe what happened to the tea that had carcinogenic materials in it, who's going to help you as a journalist understand so you can help your reader understand better. But again, we're stuck in our world of 1,000 websites without really thinking about, if I just called the one person who wrote 10 books on this, I'd have a better and a quicker answer to my questions. Another thing that the Weinberg study showed is that students would frequently go to the first website rather than scrolling to get the best website. So again, don't pick the first one because half of them are paying firms to up them in the ranks. Never mind the fact that sensational information is always so much more popular than, than probably anything else that we want to read. So that boosts that up. So just never look at that. Just always, again, constantly question, like, where is this coming from? And go down. Go a few pages in and see what you can get. How are we doing? We're doing okay. And it's sort of this idea of to ask yourself who would benefit from this information. What are their biases? We all have biases. We all reinforce our own biases all the time with everything we read, with everything we see, with everything we do. Fight those urges and just try to get sort of past that to recognize that if we have urges, if we have biases, then think about the person who's basically making millions to try to convince us to buy a product or to believe a specific thing. In terms of looking at the website, are there simple mistakes? Are there spelling mistakes? Is the URL funny? Are there details that look a little odd? Are they quoting lots of experts, or are they just, you know, basically pontificating again and again and again? If something has a mistake in it, I immediately get off the site because I just don't trust it. We find constantly with websites for the companies, we're doing a piece, we go to the website, we see what they say, this person is CEO, this person is, the name is spelled this way. Time and again, we find mistakes. Constant. It's harrowing. It really is. But just always sort of think about it. So I'd often double check things, even if it's on someone's website, because you can't always believe who's producing it. And again, like determine like how old the information is and whether a situation is in flux. Because half the times if places don't have timestamps on it, you can't really understand. Is this the most recent study? Has this been debunked? So always make sure to sort of think about that. And sort of finally, the idea of that just try to be appropriately skeptical. But being skeptical doesn't mean that you shouldn't be open to other interpretations. And just because there are issues always, and I think this is a world sort of problem, is that just because the information doesn't reinforce our own opinions and biases doesn't mean it isn't true. Constantly question your own beliefs, constantly question your own biases, constantly question others, because that is at the root of all good journalism. It's at the root of all good information. It's at the root of all good understanding. If we question things, we will actually come as close as we can to what is true. So that's my spiel.
I was amused by like your journey is to say I teach understanding data at university, a couple university classes, and we just went over how to tell if a piece of a graphic or a chart is and we went through the same steps. And you still get people that come back and say, well, she sounded really confident, so that sounds good. But there's a story I always use in my lectures about Byron Katie. She, what she taught me years ago, she does these workshops. I don't really know much about her backstory, but she says you have to be able to hold attention. So I was writing a piece about vaccinations, and my God, you want to put a lightning rod in your ear and just start writing about vaccinations. But when I was talking to the room of journalists, I said, look, you have to be able to hold the tension of a vaccine saving lives and doing well, and then you have to acknowledge that there's a vaccine adverse event reporting system where children are dying. So, you have to sit there and have those conversations. And I think once people know they can be uncomfortable, but be okay in how they tell the story, they know they're getting somewhere. Because if we just go towards what we believe, it's a hot mess.
It is. It goes to the complexity. I mean, life is complex and messy and confusing. We shouldn't oversimplify anything.
I often struggle, I cover business and the economy, in getting comment from companies on deadlines, especially right before they issue earnings reports when they're in their quiet period, or people at the Federal Reserve right before the interest rates. Like, especially in the business world, there's times when companies legit can't talk to you. What do you
Right.
do about getting comment in those circumstances?
A
Or
lot
even
of-
in a legal case?
Well, yeah, a legal case, we just work through the night and literally lift up every stone we can get in order to call every lawyer, call every person associated even with it, beg, borrow, steal. You sort of have to. Sometimes what we do in terms of business is to, again, it's also about your relationships with different places, that if you've reached out to someone early in order to say, look, I know you're not going to be able to talk to me about it at X point, can we talk now? Or, sort of, or to give some sensibility. What if it does fall? What if it does fall? You can try to sort of build up a development of that. But again, you're right in terms of not necessarily being able to get someone at the last minute. And then you almost have to act as a force whereby you can explain what something would mean. If it goes up, it's going to mean this. If it goes down, you can basically give context for it. Or to say, unfortunately, they can't be, sort of reach for comment. And then I would imagine, like after the certain period goes, to be able to update it. You mentioned that it's online, you're dealing with a lot of stuff online, to be able to go back after the fact and say, I went back after, I basically once they could speak to me, and they said it was because of X, Y, and Z. So for your purposes, it's more a level of updating, and we find ourselves doing that constantly, that we need to, we recognize we weren't able to get the comment that we wanted, so we try to update it. I think if you nod to the reader that you couldn't get a comment, that in and of itself is strong enough.
I was wondering if you could actually go over the third example on the sheet, because
yeah,
I'm
what's my
really
third
curious
example?
about the first person writing perspective
Oh,
and
yeah,
fact
no, I have that
checking
one.
in that
Thank you.
situation, particularly if you're writing about something that happened
Yeah.
to yourself.
Yeah.
And involving accusations. Literally, if you were the victim of an assault or an abuse, do you have to say, the person who assaulted me denies it? That kind of thing.
It depends on whether that person is identifiable. If that person is clearly identifiable, then yes, obviously, at that point you do need to. And the difficulty with, and it's why sort of the Rolling Stone case is so terrifying and sort of so valuable to sort of for us to understand as journalists, because it's a he said, she said situation regardless. And unfortunately, in matters of abuse, it's always sort of what you get stuck in the weeds with again and again. But if that person is identifiable in any way, like even if you say, well, sort of it was a teacher, and that teacher was in charge of my, sort of hobo group, sort of my music group, at Oberlin, that person's identifiable. So even if you're not giving the name, then you do have to give them an opportunity to say, he denies all accusations, and the school says X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. I did say hobo group. I was getting to Oberlin, so I went the wrong way, but yeah. So in that regard, that you would need to do it. But again, the concern is that it's such a personal story, and the reason why I included this in here is because, and this is sort of a very, very good journalist who basically, and this is she's telling a story from sort of 20 years ago of her experience and what happened sort of during that time, and in her memory, this is how it happened. In her husband's memory, who was her boyfriend at the time, this is how it happened. In her mother's memory, this is how it happened. This, according to Krisher, who basically has emailed me on a daily basis, or did email me on a daily basis for many a month, this is not how it happened. So we went to, for this particular piece, it's basically this woman is saying that when she was a journalist, she worked at the Cambodia Daily, and that she didn't get insurance through Krisher, who's the famous editor sort of the Daily, and that he did nothing to help her during this period of huge trauma, obviously. No phone call, no letter, what have you. So we talked to him about this and said, do you recall? Now he's very elderly, very infirm. We talked to his daughter about this, and she says, oh, I have no idea, I don't remember, blah, blah, blah. He said, I have no idea, don't remember. But of course, the moment that this came, and we made an editorial judgment that we wanted to go with it, and we felt that we had strong support for it, and we didn't, is the bottom line, because recollection and memory, especially when you're dealing with traumatic events, is hard to prove, and it's hard to accurately remember it. So what happened was, when the author was ill, And when, at least as she says, sort of no one was doing anything to help her, her mother sort of took over and was able to get her insurance. So that sort of solved the issue. But what happened is that when we published this, then Krisher came back, sort of in a tirade, saying and producing, which is even worse, emails from the time which he had desperately tried to get her insurance. And this is, nothing ever goes away if you actually need to prove something later on in life. So again, that's an instance whereby we, as sort of hands up, the checker did not press them as much as they should have. And we believed our author in a way that we shouldn't have. It's like everything else in terms of all life. It's a fuller story. Now, and the author would sort of still say this, the emails were from a few months after she had been found to be sick and when the crisis was occurring. So what is probably likely is that at the time, he didn't do much to help, but he did when, sort of at least when it either rose to his, his knowledge or something else happened. But it's extremely difficult, and you just need to be so careful about it when you're making an accusation against someone. And we run, constant, I'm working on 3 pieces on sexual assault at the moment, and it's very difficult, and especially when it's so long after the fact. And you just have to recognize that everyone has a different story to tell, and you need to be mindful of those.
Very quick, because I know we're almost
yeah, sorry.
session, but we do have one person with the mic out there. So if you can make it like a 10-second question and a 20-second answer, that'd be awesome.
Okay.
Cool.
And unrealistic, but try.
Yeah. So what's the playbook kind of when you do make a catastrophic error, and assuming Anthony Evans isn't so polite and he says, "I'm going to sue you" or something?
You immediately do everything that you can to change the story online, to basically to hands up. We were entirely wrong. We apologize, sort of for the error. We do everything in our power to make good. What can we do? We can't take back the print magazine, but we will put in every update. You'll add in editor's notes. You'll take down pieces that, we'll take down the piece that was written in and rewrite it and update it, and just do everything we can to make amends.
Yvonne, thank you so much. If everyone can give it up. Thank you guys all for coming. We've got one more session left today, so.
Do you all have the handouts from each one? Yeah? Okay, there were 4, I think.
Oh, we only have one.
Oh, okay.
All
Sorry.
right, come up here and get a
handout.
handout.
On the way out, I'll go to the back and you can, that work?
I can help hand it out
Okay.
if you want.